I have a counter potion, she said. Then why haven't you taken it? Rigel scowled up at him. I've been using both hands to not float away. Normally I can control the movement a little better, but... Allow me a guess, you overbrewed this one, too. Snape's expression could have withered the Homping Willow. She flushed. Well, I got all new ingredients, but I may have neglected to replace all the potions I made since starting to practice my magical awareness. The counter potion, Snape reminded her sharply. There's an entire stadium waiting on you. Rigel huffed, but obediently dug into her bag for the imbued finite potion, Snape tethering her to the earth until its effects kicked in. She felt gravity catch up with her in an unpleasant rush and caught herself against Snape's shoulders to steady her balance until she was certain she wouldn't fall onto her face. Thanks, she said, almost sighing with relief. I can't believe it's over. What strains credibility is that you made it through the entire course almost unscathed, Snape said. She couldn't tell for sure, but she thought he almost sounded proud. It was my sensing ability that saved me, she said, drawing herself up to full height so she could look him sincerely in the eye. I'm sorry I ever complained about having to learn it. Thank you, Professor. For everything. Snape's face softened infinitesimally. Foolish boy. Keeping you alive would be easier if you cooperated now and again. I will from now on, she promised. Rigel thought she even meant it. How are the others, she added. Is everyone all right? See for yourself, Snape said. He swept up the stairs and Rigel followed quickly, despite how bone-tired she was. At the top of the stairs was a special box, obviously set aside for the competitors. 7 of the others were present. She took a quick accounting and asked Snape, what happened to Antiope? She was unable to escape the shrinking ward. It crushed several of her bones before she fell unconscious and forfeited by default. Madame Pomfrey is seeing to her. The girl will be fine, he added after a moment, clearly reading in Rigel's pale expression the horrified concern she felt. Snape told her to wait there while the scoring was deliberated and left. Rigel stepped forward toward the front of the box, where the other 7 competitors stood at the balcony's edge. Hermione smiled grimly at her as she approached. You did really well, Hermione said bracingly. Faster than most. Was it? She couldn't hide her surprise. It felt like I was up there for ages. I felt the same, Hermione said. I think we all did. All that adrenaline. And every second you spend thinking about what to do just feels like a lifetime, doesn't it? Rigel nodded. She looked Hermione over subtly, but the Muggle-born girl caught on and smiled wryly. I'm fine, Rigel. I had a few rope burns from an unexpected incarcerus and boils down my left side from a jet of bubotuber pus, but nothing I couldn't heal myself. Are you all right? Rigel shrugged. No real injuries, except for the poisonous flower. Hermione nodded sagely. Those sleeping spores are fast-acting. I'm impressed you counteracted them so quickly. Fthian and Tariel took the same route, you know, but the spores got them both. Tariel fell off the course in his sleep, but Fthian landed on the tile. The spores wore off after 10 minutes or so, but I think they made her dizzy. She lost her balance when that antisensory mist hit her. Rigel nodded slowly. The mist takes away sight and sound but leaves the other senses. It's enough to give anyone vertigo, and coupled with the after effects of the spores and her fear of heights. Rigel glanced over to where Shang stood, pale, but not visibly injured, on the other side of the box. Tariel was with her, and they seemed united in an unspoken misery. Exactly. Hermione looked down onto the pitch, where the remains of the obstacle course were scattered in pieces all over the ground. She smiled suddenly, and it was a terrifying, fierce thing. I'm glad you destroyed it. So am I, Crumb grunted. He had sidled up to Rigel's other side while they were talking. Crumb had burn paste slathered up and down his right arm. Judging by the pattern, she guessed he'd tried to protect himself from an unexpected jet of flame with it. That task was more luck than skill. Some people had less trouble, it is true, Delacour added. Clearly the box was not big enough to prevent her from hearing their conversation. The French girl's eyes lingered briefly on Rigel but turned sharply to land on Jacob Owens, of all people. The American boy raised his eyebrows and smiled. Me. I was pretty lucky, I suppose. Maybe they went easy on me for going first. Could be Delacour allowed, but Rigel could tell that she was not convinced. She wondered why the girl was even suspicious of Owens. None of them had seen his run, since he'd gone first. Was it just because he'd got a better time? Come to think of it, she had no idea what her own time had come out to be. Sheepishly, she asked Hermione, "Did you happen to catch my time, by chance?" Hermione blinked at her in surprise, but it was Delacour who said, "You weren't even paying attention." Rigel frowned. "I had rather other things on my mind, at the end there. What with the entire obstacle course coming down around my ears." "How did you do that, anyway?" Owens asked, eyes bright with curiosity. "Even Antiope couldn't break out of that ward, and brute strength is sort of her specialty." He smiled in that strange way of his, and Rigel had to wonder again why she never found his humor amusing. "I just panicked," she said flatly. "My magic was completely uncontrolled, I'm afraid." "Hence the chain reaction," Owens said thoughtfully. "Interesting. This is why you go last," Crumb said. The smallest of smiles ticked up the corner of his mouth. Rigel scowled. There was no way to predict that would happen. After the dragon, VE knew something would happen, Crumb argued. Hermione snorted with laughter, then turned pink as Crumb's amused eyes turned on her as well. "They've finished scoring," Sousa said suddenly, drawing everyone's attention to the pitch once more. Rigel let her eyes linger on the Brazilian for a brief moment, but he, too, seemed to be in reasonably good health, though there was something utterly drained about his expression that she sympathized with. It was how she felt internally, after so much magical expenditure in so short a time. Across the pitch, directly on the opposite side of the stands, there was a golden box that jutted out from the rest. She could make out the vague features of those inside, not enough to identify them all, but enough to know that Riddle, Crouch, and Bagman all stood within. Dumbledore, too, she thought, though the old wizard was keeping to the back of the box. As though in confirmation, Bagman's voice boomed out over the pitch once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, the judges have deliberated and the scoring is concluded." Rigel's attention was interrupted by a hand on her back. She whirled around and found Pansy and Draco standing behind her. She grinned at them and fell into Pansy's brief embrace. After an almost immeasurably short moment of awkwardness, Draco clapped her on the shoulder and said, "Great job, Rigel." "You were splendid," Pansy added. Hermione turned around with a look that was as good as a pointed hushing noise. The three Slytherins fell silent to listen, and Rigel turned back toward the announcer, but neither Pansy nor Draco retreated from their close proximity to her shoulder blades. Judged on 3 categories for the second task: timeliness in completing the course, problem solving, and degree of resilience. As with the first task, problem solving is determined by the competitor's ability to match appropriate responses to the challenges encountered. Imprecise application of magic is not the goal. The final category, that of resilience, is measured by the state of health in which a competitor completed this task. Champions with fewer injuries will score higher, as it demonstrates superior reactions, efficiency of casting, and quick thinking. Before we score them, let's give all the champions another round of applause. Rigel rubbed her ears as the stadium erupted around them. She wouldn't be surprised if every person present went home harder of hearing from listening to the obnoxiously overpowered sonorous charm. For time, out of 20 points, scores are as follows: Jacob Owens, 20 points. Archerus Black, 19 points. Hermione Granger, 18 points. Fleur Delacour, 17 points. Victor Crumb, 16 points. Matthew Sousa, 15 points. Antiope, Tariel Dirk-Zahai, and Ftian Shang all receive 0 points. The crowd roared its approval or displeasure, it was impossible to tell which, and Rigel felt a hand on her shoulder again as Draco's voice dipped into her ear. "Second place. You would have been first, but Owens didn't even trigger some of the obstacles in his path." Rigel tried to listen, but the feeling of his breath against her ear distracted her completely. Her attention was yanked back to the stadium as Bagman's voice started up again. "In problem solving, out of 15 points, we have Jacob Owens, 15. Matthew Sousa, 14. Hermione Granger, 13. Fleur Delacour, 12. Victor Crumb, 11. Antiope, 8. Ftian Shang, 6. Tariel Dirk Zahai, 6. There was a pause in which Rigel wondered if Bagman had forgotten to call her name. Then he went on. After some deliberation, it was determined that Archerus Black's destruction of the obstacle course was not a conscious act of will. Nevertheless, as an overreaction, it was taken into account in his score. Rigel Black thus receives a problem-solving score of 10 points. 10. Draco's voice was incredulous. 5 points off for one bit of overzealous magic. And anyway, that ward could have killed you. How is anything an overreaction to threat of death? Are you finished? Rigel turned to smile ruefully at her friend. Honestly, she wasn't surprised they docked points for what her magic did to the course. Probably it had taken someone a very long time to assemble it. She couldn't dredge up any regret. Draco grumbled something under his breath, but did fall silent when Bagman got around to the final category. And out of 15 for resiliency, Matthew Souza, 15 points. Jacob Owens, 15 points. Archerus Black, 14. Fleur Delacour, 13. Hermione Granger, 12. Victor Crumb, 10. Tariel Dirk Zahai, 6. Ftian Shang, 6. And Antiope, 3 points. Bagman waited patiently for the cheers to die out before concluding. In first place then, with a total combined score for both tasks, Jacob Owens with 91 points. Second place with 87 is Archerus Black. Third place, Hermione Granger with 84 points. Victor Crumb in 4 with 76 points. Fleur Delacour, 5th with 72 points. 6th, Ftian Shang with 48. Antiope in 7th with 47. Tariel Dirk Zahai is in 8th place with 46 points. And bringing up 9th place is Matthew Souza with 44 points. Well done to all the champions, and good luck in the next task. Finally, mercifully, Bagman's voice cut out and left their throbbing eardrums in peace. Rigel turned back to her friends and smiled somewhat ironically. There now, that's not so bad. Congratulations, Owens, she added, raising her voice so the Muggleborn could hear. He shrugged in a way that would have been self-deprecating, had his chin not been held so high. Like I said, it was mostly luck. Still, congratulations, Hermione said, smiling brightly. It was evident how pleased she was for two Muggleborns to be represented in the top 3 champions. You too, Tariel, she called to the still disappointed-looking Somali boy. Tariel shook his head grimly. I was not fast enough to counter the flower. Just as I was not fast enough at overcoming the puzzles in the forest. Truly, I see the advantage of a formal education. Hermione had a dismayed look on her face, but she said, bracingly. Just think, though, after this tournament you will be somewhat famous, Tariel. I'm sure many schools would be happy to sponsor you if you wanted to attend. The boy's open face melted into a cheerful smile. You are right. Perhaps I can also bring my brother. I must not forget that to compete at all is a bright opportunity. Rigel had to smile at his newfound enthusiasm. Shang didn't look nearly so ready to bounce back from her disappointment. Tariel noticed too, for he said, will your sponsors be very upset, Ftian? A flush of shame crossed her pale cheeks. I think yes. I make a bad attempt. Even Fleur, normally rather callous, winced at Shang's downtrodden face. It is not your fault you are scared of heights. Shang nodded, but it was obvious she wasn't convinced. Souza huffed a laugh on his way out of the box. Cheer up, Ftian. You're still 3 places ahead of me. Souza caught Rigel's eye as he passed her and winked. She felt Draco stiffen at her shoulder. A moment later he said, we should get going, Rigel. My parents will want to congratulate you. Rigel nodded agreeably and bade the rest of the champions farewell, giving an extra smile to Hermione, who grinned back, still visibly pleased with her performance. Her friends were quiet as they made their way down the stairs from the competitor's box, but as they made it to the pitch, Pansy said, very well done, Rigel. Second place looks good strategically at this point in the tournament. Second place to a Muggleborn. Rigel clarified, her eyebrows raised. She didn't quite understand Pansy's reasoning. The points are close, and you're still firmly in the lead of the pure-blood category. Having other categories represented in the top 3 makes the whole tournament appear more legitimate, Pansy said quietly, checking first to make sure no one was near enough to hear. It helps that you're only in second because they docked you 5 points for destroying the course, Draco added sardonically. Now the tournament seems fair, and you'll still have people who secretly believe you deserve to be in first. It's a win-win. Rigel sighed. Of course it is, with Riddle determining the scores. Pansy frowned at her. Lord Riddle doesn't get a say in the scoring, she said slowly. Realization dawned and her skull deepened. You didn't read any of the supplemental reading Millie and I gave you, did you? Ah. Not exactly, she admitted, wincing. It was Pansy's turn to sigh. There are 5 official judges. Mr. Bagman and Mr. Crouch, of course. Then there's Griselda Marchbanks, head of the Wizarding Examination Services. Rigel looked sharply at Pansy, wondering if she'd misheard. Misinterpreting her surprise, Pansy added, who better qualified to judge relative adolescent magical ability? Rigel nodded. Makes sense. It seemed like a conflict of interest, though, considering the life debt the elderly witch had once pledged her. Who else, she asked, more out of obligation to satisfy Pansy's disgruntlement than out of real interest. Horace Sloane and Lord Raoul Goldentower. Sloane. The potions master. I've read his work on Felix Felicis. It's brilliant, Rigel said. Despite herself, she appreciated the idea of a potioneer on the tournament judging panel. Of course that's how you know him, Draco said, chuckling a little. Sloane isn't just an academic. He's an incredibly well-connected politician, too. Rigel hummed uninterestedly. He was a Hogwarts professor from the 30s to the 80s, Pansy told her, amusement lurking in her eyes. I hear he called in a number of favors from former students to be chosen for the honor. How'd Goldentower get chosen, then? Draco asked. His tone didn't indicate a surplus of good feeling toward the name. Lord Goldentower is notoriously neutral, and his partner founded that correspondence school for the lesser bloods. Including him and Madame Marchbanks together makes the judging panel above reproach. Rigel wasn't so sure of Pansy's assessment. Even if Riddle doesn't get a vote, he's still in the box with them while they are deliberating, isn't he? I bet he's still influencing the scores. I'm sure Lord Riddle is the picture of impartiality, Pansy hissed, warning in her eyes as they neared the center of the pitch where a group of adults stood in a loose cluster. Rigel picked out her family easily, as well as the Malfoys, the Grangers, and a number of other men and women who were probably related to the other champions. A tall, thin Asian man with a grim countenance caught her eye in particular, and she supposed by the constellation patterns embroidered down his sleeves that he was Shang's father. She hoped he wouldn't be too hard on the girl. Sirius met her with open arms, but Rigel, realizing she hadn't had a chance to reapply the odor Archie, shook her head with a wide grin. No, Dad. I'm all sweaty. Sirius let his arms drop and settled for ruffling her grimy hair instead. He grimaced at the feel of dirt and sweat and said, You weren't kidding. Still, great job, Arch. You nearly gave me a heart attack when you jumped off the edge of the path, but I have to admit using Harry's potion was clever. It was, Lily agreed, leaning around Sirius' form to smile at Rigel warmly. We'd seen it at the World Cup, and it still caught us by surprise. Remus elbowed Sirius to the side so he could smile down at Rigel and put a light hand on her shoulder. You were brilliant, Archie. Had a little trouble with the runic barrier on the right-hand path, did you? Rigel grimaced. Not exactly. It was a straightforward sequence. I just didn't want to do what it said. What? Draco's alarmed voice had her glancing over to where he was waiting beside his parents, who had hung back to give Rigel's family the first chance to congratulate her. Rigel frowned at him and Draco frowned back. How could you, I mean, weren't you worried about doing your best? The odd way he phrased it told her he was concerned about the vow but didn't want to say so openly. She smiled reassuringly. A little, but in the end the way forward was intolerable. So I chose another course very quickly, without dwelling too much on the consequences. Draco did not seem reassured by that explanation, but Lord Malfoy looked terribly intrigued. What was this intolerable way forward, then? A spell too costly to perform, perhaps. Rigel has plenty of magic, Narcissa disagreed, smiling indulgently in her direction. I think we all saw that when he overcame the shrinking ward. That was an incredible flare of magic, wasn't it? James added, grinning proudly. Reminds me of you, dear, he added to Lily, who swatted him without heat in retaliation. But what did the runic sequence want to you do? Remus asked, frowning. Seeing that he would not be distracted, Rigel grimaced. It wanted blood. Human blood, specifically, so I couldn't just use my potions kit. The adults grew sober around her, and James said sharply, that's dark magic. The Malfoys all stiffened. A blood ward itself isn't necessarily dark, Narcissa said carefully, quelling her husband's fierce expression with a look. Lucius' nostrils flared, but he didn't say anything as his wife added, nevertheless, we should not be encouraging children to spill their own blood so cavalierly. Pansy made a noise of realization. Rigel, you said once that willingly spilled blood can be quite dangerous if it falls into the wrong hands. Is that why you didn't do it? Rigel nodded, remembering the day she'd spilled blood into a goblet in the Malfoy gardens quite clearly. Smart lad, Sirius said, nodding firmly. You made the right choice. She wondered if all parties would see it that way. Rigel knew she was prone to paranoia when it came to Riddle, but she couldn't help but suspect that barrier had been there for a reason. Internally, she could justify the decision to move laterally in the task with the thought that if the barrier somehow had a recognition component to it, then it was a greater risk to her odds of winning the tournament to go through with it than it was to try another route. After all, if she was outed as a half-blood in the second task, there was no way she could do her best in the rest of the tournament. The explanation could not be shared with Riddle, however. Would he wonder why the vow had not stopped her from taking a different path? Would he believe that she had simply made the decision too fast for the vow to react? The other champions eventually made their way to the center of the pitch as well, picking out routes around the fallen debris of tiles. A few of them were still ominously colored, and Rigel was glad to see the tournament organizers coming toward their group. Surely they would take care of the hazards. To her bemusement, however, Bagman and Crouch seemed more interested in socializing with the friends and families of the champions, and Riddle was nowhere to be seen. A tall man with graying hair, bright eyes, and a rather generous middle inserted himself into their group with a pleased, Lucius Malfoy. It has been too long. Mr. Malfoy had an odd expression on his face when he greeted the newcomer. It was something between amusement and carefully jaded appreciation. Horace, well met. I trust your duties have not been too taxing this day. Taxing? It's an honor, the man said jovially. I haven't had this much fun in ages. James, Sirius, so glad you could make it out today. Pitch looks a bit different than it did in your days at Hogwarts, eh? You could say that, James aloud. I wouldn't call it an improvement, Sirius added wryly, looking around at the rubble in false consideration. Delighted laughter poured out of the taller man's throat. Always quick with a joke, this one. Yes, I remember well. And who might this young man be? He peered down at Rigel with unconcealed fascination, and she wondered if he meant to be as alarmingly interested as he came across. There was no way he didn't know who she was, either. As if you couldn't guess, Sirius said, wagging his eyebrows. This is my son, Archerus Black, who prefers to go by Archie, or Rigel, for his friends. Arch, this is Horace Sloane, best potions professor who ever lived. Ignoring the subtle dig at Snape, Rigel extended her hand politely and said, It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance, sir. I'm a great admirer of your work. Oh. Sloane's eyebrows quivered as his smile curled upwards. What work might that be, young man? Well, all of it, she admitted, but I particularly enjoyed the essay on your demonstrated improvements to Zygmunt Buch's centennial recipe for Felix Felicis. Sloane raised a hand to his chest dramatically and cried, My word. A potioneer indeed. I admit I suspected Severus might be exaggerating just a tad. Your work with the dried chimera eyes, if I am not mistaken, was a delight to witness today, Rigel. Thank you, Master Sloane, she said, smiling a little. I hadn't expected anyone to recognize the ingredient in that context. I've a sharp eye, Sloane agreed. Those weren't exploding beans. Sirius looked genuinely surprised. It is good to know someone with an appreciation for talent is on the judging panel, Narcissa said smoothly. Sirius shot her a scowl, but oddly, he didn't seem to mean it. Sloane's smile was irrepressible. Oh, Narcissa, you do flatter an old man. I must say it is a delight to have a potioneer in the competition. Your handling of the werewolf in the first task was quite admirable, you know. And of course that leap you made. Why, I don't think I've seen a potion with quite the same effect before. His curious gaze waited for an explanation. Rigel smiled. Both potions are my cousin's invention. I'm sure she'd be happy to send you a sample. Miss Potter, yes of course, Sloane said, shooting James and Lily an emphatic look. Your daughter has been keeping us all on our toes at the guild. That's Harry, James said weakly. Full of surprises. I wouldn't have done so well without her help, Rigel put in for good measure. She wanted no one to think it odd that she'd used so many of Harry's skill sets in the tournament. Every week she sends me more potions that might be useful. No amount of potions can teach level-headedness in the face of danger, James said firmly. You've got that all on your own, sport. Well said. And a very Gryffindor attitude, Sloane remarked slyly. I dare say old habits are hard to kick. I myself was in Slytherin as well when I attended this grand school, he told Rigel in a confidential tone. But of course, I didn't discriminate based on house as a professor. I pride myself on recognizing talent wherever it comes from. Rigel couldn't help noticing Lily and Remus exchanging a wry look behind Sloane's back. She didn't miss the fact that Remus had not been included in the conversation at all, despite having been at Hogwarts with James and Sirius when Sloane was teaching there. Then it's no wonder you were one of only 5 wizards chosen to judge the tournament, she said, letting a light of admiration enter her eyes as she looked up at him. The ex-professor wagged a finger at her obsequiousness, but there was an undercurrent of satisfaction there nonetheless. Sloane didn't seem like an overly bad sort, and his potions work was unquestionably superb, but she wondered how a man so transparently easy to please could do so well in politics, too. Perhaps it really was that simple, she thought. If you had no ulterior motives, people were more likely to trust you and solicit your help or advice. Maybe Sloane's desire to be praised and acknowledged was effective precisely because it was so seemingly easy to oblige. The potions master left their company shortly thereafter, off to wrangle an introduction to the other champions he considered interesting, she didn't doubt. The Malfoys stayed just long enough to convey their sincere congratulations to Rigel on the completion of the second task before they, too, made their goodbyes. Draco and Pansy hesitated, clearly not wanting to leave Rigel's side, but she gave them a reassuring smile and said, I'll catch up with you in the common room. My family will probably stay a while longer, if they're allowed. We've got another 20 minutes before we're escorted out of the ward, Sirius confirmed after a quick tempest charm. Pansy gave Rigel a quick smile and gracefully bade the adults farewell. Draco was less smooth, nodding without saying anything but casting a long, lingering look her way as Pansy took his arm to leave the pitch. Rigel kept her face even, not willing to reveal even the slightest amount of her internal discomfort in front of her family. Archie would never hear the end of it if Sirius or James picked something up about her increasingly complicated relationship with Draco from her expression or voice. She just knew Sirius had been eagerly awaiting the day he could tease his son about his first crush, but this was not something she was willing to allow. The circumstances were too confusing. Too personal. She pretended to listen to her family's exuberant recounting of the second task, including all the parts she'd missed while stuck in the tent, but her mind kept wandering back to Draco. Why couldn't she find an equilibrium with regards to him again? Would it be like this between her and Leo when she went back to the alleys over winter break, too? Romance was so annoyingly intrusive, she fumed silently. It ruined otherwise perfect friendships, burdened her relationships with both Leo and Draco with some kind of vague expectation that she felt incapable of meeting. However patient or understanding their regard, and she had to admit that both Leo and Draco had been very understanding, in their own ways, it was still there, hanging in the air between them like the ghost of what could have been. Rigel forcibly refocused her attention on her family. Family was a different kind of complication these days, she thought. The crisscrossing weight of different personas, lies, and truths all mixed together was getting heavier. Every task they attended was a risk that she might expose herself, might be forced to reveal a skill that Archie had no way of recreating, in the name of winning. With that in mind, she thanked them profusely for coming as their 20 remaining minutes dwindled to a close. Then, she paused, biting her lip in the way Archie often did when he didn't want to say something but didn't know how to hold it back, either. Sirius, of course, noticed at once. "What is it, Arch?" He searched Rigel's eyes for some hint of the source of her sudden reticence. "Are you handling everything okay?" She nodded, though she did it unconvincingly. After a worried look between Sirius, James, Lily, and Remus, she said, "I was just thinking, the next task is going to be harder, isn't it? They keep getting harder, and I'm so grateful that you all keep coming to support me, but..." "But what, Archie?" James looked concerned now, too. "I just..." She sighed, just as Archie would have when he was on the verge of giving in to his own irrepressible honesty. "It's hard sometimes, knowing you're all watching me compete. Sometimes I get so nervous. I don't want to disappoint you. You could never disappoint us." Sirius said it so fiercely that Rigel had a hard time continuing. She knew she had to, though. The more her family saw, the more elaborate the lies would become. "But what if I did?" She let her eyes grow wet, thinking of how Archie would feel to know she was straining his relationship with his father again for her own ends. "Sometimes I want to try things, take risks, but knowing you're watching I just can't." "What are you saying, Archie?" Lily asked, a soft sympathy in her tone. "You'd rather we didn't come to the tasks." Bless her for saying it. Archie would not have been able to. Rigel didn't have to fully affect the miserable expression on her face as she shrugged helplessly. "I don't know. I don't know." Remus, insightful and empathetic to a fault, said softly, "We don't want to add to the pressure you're already under. If it's easier for you to focus on the tasks without us watching, just tell us. All we want is for you to get through this tournament safely. None of us want you to feel as though you have to perform well for our sake." "He's right," James said firmly. "Whatever will help you concentrate on what's important, that's what we want." Rigel smiled tremulously. "I don't want you to think I don't want your support. It means more to me than you can know." She let her voice crack just slightly. "It's hard to disregard your presence, though. Everyone else I can block out while I'm in the task, but you're too important to me. Wondering what you're thinking as you watch me compete is sort of..." She trailed off into a whisper for the last word. "Distracting." As Sirius' face crumpled, she felt like the worst sort of monster. Surely, there was a special circle of hell reserved for people who brought that exact expression of dismay and crushing helplessness to a parent's face. "I'm sorry," she whispered, turning her face down in shamed remorse. "No," Sirius said, a hitch in his voice. "Don't be. It's okay. I understand, Arch. If it will help, we won't come to the tasks. As long as you know that we do support you. We're here for you, whatever you need." Rigel flung herself into Sirius' arms, pretending to stifle a sob in her throat. "Thanks, Dad. I know you'll love me no matter what. I'll tell you everything that happens, and I promise I'll be safe. I have to do this on my own. You know." Sirius tucked her head under his chin and squeezed her tight. "I know, Arch. I wish I could fight this battle for you, but I know I can't. If you need us to support you from afar, then that's what we'll do. Right, everyone?" Rigel pulled back to see James, Remus, and Lily all nodding solemnly. She didn't have to summon the tears that filled her eyes at their unwavering understanding and support. They came all the same. It was a tearful goodbye all around. Rigel watched the four adults whose unconditional love she didn't deserve move toward the gates and took a moment to compose herself. There in the center of an empty stadium, surrounded by the physical remnants of her own magic's destructive capabilities, she'd never felt so alone. By the time she felt ready to rejoin her classmates in the castle, the other champions had long gone, and Rigel was the last one on the pitch. The sun was beginning to set, and in its wake a brittle cold settled over the evening. Rigel trudged toward the exit, turning the day's events over in her mind and marveling at the idea that she was a third of the way through the cursed tournament. That was something, at least. As she passed under the stands on the way out of the stadium, a voice that might have been conjured from her nightmares floated toward her on a hiss that was almost a sigh. "You were incandescent today, Rigel. You're well on your way to achieving everything you want." She almost kept walking. Only the thought that he must be truly desperate to speak to her if he'd been lurking under the bleachers for an untold amount of time, and the subsequent deduction that if that was the case he would be willing to follow her up to the castle, stayed her feet. "You're the man of the hour, not me," she said, turning to peer into the shadows. "Isn't this tournament about accomplishing what you want, and nothing else?" "I never do anything for just one reason," Riddle said, emerging from the shimmer of a strong disillusionment charm and stepping close enough to discourage speaking at a normal volume. He wore a deep shade of midnight blue, and whether he meant it to or not the fabric seemed to disappear at the edges, so that Riddle almost looked as though he was floating within the shadows, rather than in front of them. "That is something you are too young to understand as yet. Still, you're far from hopeless. I see Severus has been training you well." She had nothing to say to that, and kept her face blank. Rigel was as yet still furious at the man for attempting to circumvent the vow they'd made by pushing through his odious marriage legislation early. He took in her expressionless silence and tilted his head, allowing his cold eyes to narrow thoughtfully. "You do not approve of Severus' lessons," he guessed. Rigel fought against a sneer. That's what he thought she was annoyed about. "I don't care about that." "What do you care about, Rigel Black?" Riddle loomed over her, so close she would swear she could feel the unwanted resonance between them, buzzing under her skin. It was probably in her head. "You lied to me," she bit out after debating the wisdom of keeping quiet. "Careful what you accuse me of, boy." Gone was the silken, indulgent tone. Riddle's voice could have cut glass. "I know what you've been doing, what the SOW party's been doing to push the marriage law through." Her face was growing warm with the effort of keeping her anger in check. "You said you would withdraw that legislation. If you win," he hissed. It took her a moment to realize he had slipped into Parseltongue. Whether from fury or a desire for secrecy she didn't know. "I said I would withdraw the attempt if you win. And I will. Unless it passes first." The implication, she tried, but he cut her off again. "Don't be a fool. Did you really think I'd let it go, the work of years, without so much as a fight?" Riddle dropped the Parseltongue to laugh low at her frustrated expression. "Oh, Rigel. I know you're more intelligent than this. In any case, you are mistaken if you think your protest will sway me. We've already struck our deal. While you may hinder my efforts for future legislation after this tournament, the marriage law is too important. There are other ways to consolidate your power base," she snapped. "Ways that don't step on individual freedoms." Riddle shook his head, almost pityingly. "You can't begin to understand my reasons. And you don't have to. You don't get a say at all, I'm afraid." At her mutinous expression, his smile, if anything, grew. "Think of this as a learning opportunity, Rigel. A lesson on formulating agreements. One day, you may even thank me." "I'll never thank you for anything," she thought, her eyes flashing with the force of her defiance. "Speaking of lessons, the offer still stands, you know." Riddle's face was open, expectant. Rigel couldn't fathom his meaning. "What offer?" Impatience clouded his expression before he tossed it off with an annoyed jerk of his head. "Your magic, Rigel. I can help you train it. Severus has been very helpful, but his preparation is methodical. Thought-driven. You won't be able to think your way through the next task." "Is that so?" Rigel had to wonder if this was his true reason for forestalling her when she was alone. Was he here to warn her about the next task directly? It still irked her that he thought she needed his intervention to win, but she was not so prideful as to refuse the information. In this, at least, their goal was the same, and the sanctity of the tournament's moral ground meant little to her when she understood the purpose behind its fair facade. He seemed to know that she couldn't resist listening to whatever information he deigned to give her, for he was smiling once more. "The third task will test your reflexes, your magical ability in the most immediate and dangerous of circumstances. And your opponent won't be a creature or runic array without the intelligence to fight back." Rigel blinked, almost surprised at its simplicity. "You're talking about a duel. Very good." He smirked down at her. "Given enough time, I can make you unequaled in this arena. Even with just a handful of days under my tutelage, you would be nigh unstoppable." This time, Rigel smirked back at him. "I can handle my own training for this one." His subtly cajoling smile turned sour. Have you stopped to think about the opportunity you're spurning out of this childish spite? There are a great many wizards who would be grateful to be in your position, he snarled. Then go find one of them, she breathed, utterly perplexed as to why he insisted on, what? Mentoring her. It was absurd. Did he think her hatred for him was something changeable? Some fleeting fit of adolescent pique? He would learn otherwise. She stalked away from the stadium, from Riddle, and from the unbridled aggravation he kindled in her heart. In fact, she thought as she made her way swiftly up the long lawn, he'd already given her the perfect platform from which to cement her opposition, hadn't he? If she made it to the final round, she wondered how many people would be interested in hearing the pureblood champions take on the new legislation the SOW party was so confidently proposing. More than none, she thought darkly. And that's a start. -0, 0 -0. -0, 0. -0. End of chapter 9.